Picture this: you are standing on the northern frontier of the Delhi Sultanate. The year is 1299. The wind blowing down from the Khyber Pass is freezing, but you are sweating through your armor. You are staring at the horizon, waiting for the end of the world. For decades, you have heard the campfire stories of a demonic horde from the steppes that wiped entire civilizations off the map. You have heard how they stacked human skulls into pyramids in Baghdad, how they turned the rivers of Persia black with ink and red with blood. You thought it was a myth. You thought they would never reach India. Then the horizon starts to vibrate. A massive wall of black dust swallows the sky. It is not a storm. It is 200,000 horses ridden by men who do not know the definition of mercy. The Mongol Empire has finally come for you, and they are not here to collect taxes. They are here to erase your existence. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the sheer, paralyzing terror of this moment, you have to forget everything you think you know about medieval warfare. By the time the 13th century was coming to a close, the Mongol war machine had already broken the spine of the known world. They were not a traditional army. They were a natural disaster with a cavalry. From the frozen forests of Russia to the bustling metropolises of China, they had slaughtered their way into the history books, treating human lives like dry grass in a forest fire. The faction knocking on India's door was the Chagatai Khanate, a massive, hyper-aggressive splinter of Genghis Khan's original empire. They had been probing the Indian borders for years, launching small raids, testing the waters, bleeding the frontier towns dry. But the invasion of 1299 was entirely different. This was not a smash-and-grab operation. The leader of this horde, Qutlugh Khwaja, brought his entire military apparatus. He brought 200,000 seasoned killers. He brought their families, their livestock, and their siege engines. This massive migration of violence meant only one thing. They were not planning to loot Delhi and go home. They were planning to exterminate the local population, occupy the land, and turn the fertile plains of India into permanent grazing pastures for their horses. Every kingdom that had ever looked at the Mongol horde and tried to stand their ground had been violently disassembled. The European knights had been humiliated. The Islamic caliphates had been crushed. The Chinese dynasties had been swallowed whole. The Mongols possessed a tactical supremacy that baffled the minds of traditional generals. Their composite bows could punch through armor at terrifying distances. Their light cavalry maneuvers were faster than medieval communication lines, and their psychological warfare was simply unparalleled. They made sure you knew exactly what would happen to your wife and children if you resisted, breaking their enemies' minds long before the first arrow was ever fired. So when the Chagatai Khanate marched south through the mountain passes and poured into the Indian subcontinent, the script was already written. The Sultanate of Delhi was supposed to crumble. The Indian defenders were supposed to panic, break formation, and get hunted down like animals in an open field. The world fully expected the rich, vibrant civilization of India to be reduced to a smoldering graveyard, just like Baghdad, just like Kiev, just like Nishapur. As the Mongol war machine rolled closer, a tidal wave of desperate refugees flooded into the capital city of Delhi, the streets choked with starving, terrified people carrying whatever they could grab before their villages were burned to ash. The panic was absolute. The city markets shut down. The air grew thick with the stench of fear and overcrowding. The citizens of Delhi looked at their stone walls and knew they were simply not thick enough to stop the impending apocalypse. The Mongol generals rode toward the city with absolute, unshakable arrogance. They thought they were marching toward another easy slaughter. They had no idea they were marching straight into a meat grinder of their own making. To understand why the city of Delhi did not simply collapse under the sheer psychological weight of the Mongol approach, you have to look at the man sitting on the throne. The Mongols were used to fighting aristocratic kings. They were used to fighting men who inherited their power, men who understood politics, diplomacy, and the necessity of surrender. But the Sultan of Delhi in 1299 was not a politician. Alauddin Khalji was a monster. And as history often violently demonstrates, sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to unleash a bigger one. Alauddin did not inherit his crown through a peaceful transition of power. He stole it in a river of blood. Just 3 years prior, the throne belonged to his uncle, an old, trusting man who loved him deeply. Alauddin lured his uncle to a meeting on the banks of the Ganges River under the guise of loyalty and affection. When the old sultan stepped forward to embrace his nephew, Alauddin gave a silent signal. An assassin stepped up and drove a blade straight into the old man's back. While his uncle bled out in the mud, gasping for air and asking why, Alauddin felt absolutely nothing. He simply ordered his men to cut off the uncle's head, stick it on a spear, and parade it through the military camps. He literally bought the loyalty of the army by throwing gold coins into the eager crowd while his uncle's severed head dripped blood onto the dirt. This was the man the Mongols were coming to intimidate. You cannot intimidate a man who lacks the fundamental capacity for empathy. Alauddin Khalji was a paranoid, ruthless, hyper-controlling tyrant who ruled his empire with an iron fist that would make modern dictators take notes. He trusted no one. He planted spies in the homes of his own nobles. He banned secret meetings. He even banned the sale of alcohol because he believed drunk men were more likely to plot rebellions. If you crossed him, he did not just execute you. He executed your wives, your children, and anyone who had the misfortune of sharing your last name. He turned the Delhi Sultanate into a massive, heavily militarized police state where the punishment for failure was always excruciatingly fatal. Under normal circumstances, a ruler this tyrannical would fracture his own kingdom. The people would rise up, the economy would crash, and the empire would burn from the inside out. But the year was 1299 and the circumstances were anything but normal. The world was burning and the Mongol war machine was actively chewing its way down the map. The harsh reality of this dark chapter in history is that a good, moral, and just king would have gotten India completely annihilated. A noble king would have tried to negotiate, a compassionate king would have hesitated to sacrifice his own soldiers. Alauddin Khalji never hesitated. He looked at the staggering numbers of the Chagatai Khanate and did not feel the paralyzing dread that had broken so many other monarchs. He felt a cold, calculating rage. The Mongols were threatening his property. They were challenging his absolute authority. His advisors, terrified of the 200,000 horsemen riding toward their capital, begged the Sultan to hide. They pleaded with him to stay behind the thick stone walls of Delhi, to wait out the storm, to send diplomats and offer heavy tribute. They told him that facing the unstoppable light cavalry of the Mongols in an open field was strategic suicide. Alauddin looked at his trembling generals and laughed. He told them that a king who hides behind walls is no king at all. He knew that paying tribute to the Mongols was like feeding a stray wolf. It would only ensure they came back tomorrow for the rest of the meat. He decided right then and there that he would not cower in his fortress. He commanded his massive army to march out of the city gates. He did not ask for volunteers. His soldiers knew that deserting the battlefield meant a horrific death at the hands of their own sultan. They were trapped between the unstoppable force of the Mongol horde and the immovable object of Alauddin's wrath. The Mongols thought they were bringing hell to India, but they did not realize the devil was already running the country. To grasp the sheer scale of the nightmare descending upon India, you have to look at the mathematics of the Mongol war machine. 200,000 cavalrymen do not just march, they consume. Every single Mongol warrior traveled with 3 to 5 remount horses. That means almost 1 million horses were tearing up the earth as they moved south from the Hindu Kush mountains. They stripped the land bare like a biblical plague of locusts. They drank rivers down to the mud. They devoured every scrap of grain, every head of cattle, and every living thing in their path. The Chagatai Khanate did not rely on vulnerable supply lines creeping up from the rear. They were a self-contained ecosystem of violence. If a Mongol rider got thirsty in the middle of a desert, he did not look for an oasis. He simply opened a small vein in the neck of his horse, drank a few gulps of hot blood, sealed the wound, and kept riding. You cannot starve an army that drinks from its own transportation. As this tidal wave of flesh and steel rolled through the Punjab region, it deployed a weapon far more devastating than arrows or swords. They weaponized panic. The Mongols were masters of psychological contagion. When they surrounded a frontier town, they did not just kill everyone inside. That would be a waste of a perfectly good terror tactic. Instead, they would deliberately butcher 90% of the population in the most horrific ways imaginable, leaving the bodies piled in the streets to rot in the sun. But they would intentionally let the remaining 10% escape. These traumatized, blood-soaked survivors would run to the next city, bringing with them stories of literal demons who could shoot birds out of the sky and who built mountains out of human skulls. By the time the Mongol vanguard was anywhere near Delhi, the psychological war had already been won. The vanguard did not even have to fight. The mere rumor of their approach caused entire garrisons to drop their weapons and run. Millions of refugees flooded the roads leading to the capital, abandoning their ancestral homes, carrying weeping children and whatever meager possessions they could strap to their backs. They poured into Delhi looking for salvation, but what they found was a claustrophobic death trap. Delhi was a massive, prosperous metropolis, but it was never designed to hold the entire population of northern India. The city swelled until it choked. The streets became impassable rivers of starving, terrified humanity. Disease began to spread through the alleys. Food prices skyrocketed in a matter of hours, turning neighbors against each other for a handful of stale rice. The air inside the capital grew thick, asphyxiating, and heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and raw fear. The Mongol commander, Qutlugh Khwaja, knew exactly what he was doing. He was packing the slaughterhouse. He wanted Delhi overflowing with useless mouths to feed so that the city would consume itself from the inside out before he even ordered a single siege engine to fire. He set up his massive camp at Kili, just a few miles from the city walls. He did not rush. He let his horses graze. He let his men sharpen their sabers in plain sight of the city. He wanted the people of Delhi to look out from their battlements and see an ocean of campfires stretching out to the horizon, a visual reminder that they were entirely cut off from the rest of the world. Qutlugh Khwaja sat in his tent, absolutely confident in the mathematical certainty of his victory. He knew that the Sultan of Delhi was trapped. If Alauddin stayed behind the walls, his own starving citizens would riot, tear him to pieces, and open the gates. If Alauddin marched out, his clumsy traditional army would be ripped to shreds by the fastest light cavalry on the planet. Checkmate, or so he thought. He failed to account for the fact that the Sultan was just as psychotic as he was, and that the Indian army was about to bring a living, breathing weapon to the battlefield that the horses of the steppes had never seen before. The plains of Kili, just a few miles outside the choking walls of Delhi, offered no places to hide. It was a flat, dry expanse of baked earth, a perfect theatre for a cavalry massacre. On the morning of the battle, the dust hung in the cold air like a thick yellow fog. Qutlugh Khwaja and his Mongol commanders sat on their horses, looking across the barren stretch of land, waiting for the slaughter to begin. They watched as the massive wooden gates of Delhi groaned open. What marched out was not a terrified mob of starving conscripts. It was a meticulously organized, heavily armored wall of human defiance. Alauddin Khalji had emptied his garrisons. He marched out with roughly 300,000 men. But numbers alone meant nothing to the Mongols. They had butchered larger armies before breakfast. What mattered was the horrific, unyielding composition of the Delhi war machine. This was not a fragile European army made of arrogant knights and untrained peasants. The Delhi Sultanate's military was a ruthless amalgamation of professional killers. It was packed with battle-hardened Turkic mercenaries, fierce Afghan veterans, and Rajput warriors who considered dying in combat to be a spiritual promotion. They marched into position in absolute, terrifying silence. There were no panicked shouts, no breaking of ranks, just the deafening, rhythmic crunch of hundreds of thousands of boots hitting the dirt, moving with a mechanical precision that made the Mongol scouts sit up a little straighter in their saddles. Alauddin had made one rule abundantly clear before the gates opened. Any man who took a single step backward would not be killed by the Mongols. He would be violently executed by his own officers. The Indian soldiers were literally bolted to the earth by the terror of their own sultan. Then the ground began to shake. It was not the rapid, staccato vibration of a cavalry charge. It was a slow, deep, seismic thud that rattled the teeth in the Mongols' skulls. Through the morning dust, the true nightmare of the Indian arsenal revealed itself. War elephants, hundreds of them forming a living, breathing fortress wall across the front line. The Mongols were the undisputed masters of horseback warfare, but absolutely nothing on the frozen Asian steppes could have prepared their mounts for the sight and smell of a 3-ton biological tank. These were not just large animals, they were engineered weapons of mass trauma. Their thick grey hides were draped in heavy iron chainmail that draped down to their knees. Their massive tusks were fitted with poisoned steel blades, perfectly designed to slice a galloping horse in half with a casual swipe of the head. On top of these moving fortresses sat reinforced wooden towers, packed tightly with elite archers and men holding pots of naphtha, volatile incendiary explosives ready to rain liquid fire down upon the light cavalry. To the steppe ponies of the Mongol horde, an elephant was an alien monster. The pungent, musky scent of the beasts rolled across the plains, and the Mongol lines immediately began to ripple with uncontrollable panic. Horses reared up, bucking desperately, their evolutionary instincts screaming at them to run. For the first time in their lives, the Mongol riders had to physically fight their own mounts just to keep them facing the enemy. Alauddin Khalji rode back and forth behind his lines, an orchestra conductor of violence preparing for the opening note. He knew that the Mongol tactical playbook relied entirely on fluid mobility, flanking, and psychological collapse. The elephants were his brutal countermeasure. They were flesh and blood breakwaters. If the Mongol light cavalry tried to sweep in and unleash their devastating arrow storms, they would have to navigate around these armored behemoths, breaking their momentum and exposing themselves to the heavy Indian infantry. The two deadliest military forces on the planet stared at each other across the killing field. The air grew suffocatingly tight. On one side, a nomadic force of nature that had erased entire civilizations. On the other, a desperate, heavily armored superpower led by a psychopath with his back against the wall. The silence stretched until it felt like the sky itself was going to shatter. Qutlugh Khwaja realized his easy victory was an illusion. He raised his hand, the Mongol war drums began to pound their hypnotic, terrifying rhythm, and the meat grinder was officially turned on. When the Mongol-like cavalry finally initiated the assault, they did not scream or beat their chests like barbarians in a fictional story. They moved with the cold, terrifying synchronicity of a machine. At 300 yards, the sky above the plains of Kili simply ceased to exist. It was replaced by a solid sheet of black wood and iron. The Mongol composite bow was an engineering marvel, boasting a draw weight that could snap a modern man's arm, and they were firing thousands of these armor-piercing missiles every single second. The sound of that many arrows tearing through the air was a deafening mechanical hiss, followed by the wet, sickening crunch of iron punching through human flesh, bone, and bronze armor. The front lines of the Delhi army took the impact like a brick wall, taking a sledgehammer. Men died in droves, pinned to the dirt, their lungs pierced, their shields splintered. But the line did not collapse. The Indian infantrymen knew that running from the arrows only guaranteed a slower, more agonizing death by torture at the hands of Alauddin's executioners. So, they stepped over the bleeding corpses of their friends, locked their shields tighter, and waited. Then the Sultan unleashed his biological tanks. When the armored war elephants began their advance, the fundamental laws of medieval combat were rewritten in blood. You have to understand the sheer, absurd physics of this collision. A sturdy Mongol steppe pony weighed roughly 600 pounds. A fully grown Indian war elephant draped in heavy iron mail and carrying a wooden fortress on its back weighed over 8,000 pounds. This was not a cavalry clash, it was a freight train slamming into a bicycle lane. As the elephants lumbered forward, the carefully orchestrated fluid tactics of the Mongols completely disintegrated. The steppe ponies, animals bred for endurance and obedience, suddenly encountered a sensory nightmare their genetics had no defense against. The pungent, overwhelming stench of elephant musk hit the Mongol horses like a physical blow. Their eyes rolled back in their skulls. They reared up, foaming at the mouth, wildly bucking and throwing their riders into the dust. For the first time in the history of their conquests, the Mongol riders found themselves entirely out of control of their own mounts, and then the elephants hit the front line. It was an absolute massacre. The massive beasts waded into the chaotic sea of panicked horses and screaming men, swinging their heads with devastating momentum. The poisoned steel blades, bolted to their tusks, acted like giant scythes, effortlessly amputating the legs of Mongol horses and slicing armored riders in half. Appendages the thickness of tree trunks reached down, wrapping around the waists of hardened steppe warriors, lifting them effortlessly into the air and violently smashing them against the baked earth until their bones turned to powder. Above this ground-level slaughter, the soldiers in the wooden towers on the elephants' backs were shooting down into the tightly packed Mongol ranks with absolute impunity. But arrows were the least of the Mongols' problems. The Indian soldiers were dropping clay pots filled with naphtha, a highly volatile liquid incendiary. The pots shattered on the helmets of the Mongol cavalry, igniting instantly. Men and horses were swallowed in sticky, inextinguishable flames, burning alive inside their armor, their screams adding to the deafening apocalyptic roar of the elephants. The Mongol generals watched in absolute horror as their invincible vanguard was pulverized into red paste. Their signature move, the sweeping arrow storm, was useless against 3 inches of elephant skull and heavy iron plate. Their mobility was gone, trapped in a chaotic traffic jam of terrified horses and burning bodies. The Chagatai Khanate had brought a perfectly tuned war machine to India, but the Sultan of Delhi had brought an industrial meat grinder. And as the smoke settled over the first hour of combat, the Mongols realized with a sickening cold dread that for the very first time in their lives they were the meat. While the armored elephants were busy turning the center of the battlefield into a biological meat grinder, the absolute climax of the Mongols' nightmare was unfolding on the right flank. This wing of the Delhi army was not commanded by a cautious defensive tactician. It was commanded by a man named Zafar Khan. If Alauddin Khalji was the cold, calculating psychopath sitting on the throne, Zafar Khan was his rabid attack dog on the battlefield. In a military culture defined by extreme, unforgiving violence, Zafar Khan was widely considered a savant of bloodshed. He was the greatest military commander of his generation, and he suffered from a pathological inability to comprehend the concept of retreat. The Mongols, desperately reeling from the concussive shock of the elephant charge, attempted to do what they always did when a direct assault collapsed. They tried to rapidly pivot, regroup, and hit the flanks. Qutlugh Khwaja signaled his commanders to direct a concentrated, overwhelming arrow storm onto Zafar Khan's position. The standard operating procedure for any medieval army facing a Mongol barrage was to hunker down, overlap their shields, and simply pray to survive the rain of iron. But Zafar Khan did not believe in absorbing punishment. He believed in inflicting it. Instead of ordering his men to hold the line, Zafar Khan drew his heavy steel sword, spurred his barded warhorse, and ordered a catastrophic, full, frontal countercharge directly into the teeth of the Mongol archery. He led a massive, terrifying contingent of heavily armored Turkic and Rajput cavalry. These were men who rode horses, clad in thick, boiled leather and chainmail. Warriors who carried heavy maces designed specifically to cave in a human ribcage with a single, blunt force swing. They did not attempt to outflank the swift steppe riders. They rode straight through the falling arrows, trampling their own dead, and slammed into the Mongol left wing with the raw, kinetic force of a localized earthquake. The Mongol-like cavalry was instantly dragged into a horrifying, claustrophobic brawl. Their legendary composite bows, the weapons that had conquered half the known world, were rendered entirely useless when a Rajput heavy cavalryman was 2 feet away, swinging a spiked mace directly at their face. The physical reality of the melee was sickening. The light armor of the steppe riders crumpled like cheap tin under the heavy downward strikes of the Indian weapons. Skulls were fractured, collarbones were shattered, and the swift steppe ponies were brutally crushed under the overwhelming weight of the Delhi heavy cavalry. Zafar Khan fought at the very tip of the spear, completely covered in the blood of his enemies, screaming orders and cutting a path of sheer, unadulterated devastation through the elite Mongol ranks. He fought with a reckless, almost suicidal fury that deeply unsettled the hardened veterans of the Chagatai Khanate. The Mongols were accustomed to seeing sheer terror in the eyes of their opponents. They were used to seeing formations fracture and men flee for their lives. But when they looked into the eyes of Zafar Khan and his charging cavalry, they saw a terrifying, unblinking fanaticism. Zafar Khan was not just holding the line to protect his city, he was actively hunting them for sport. Under the sheer, unrelenting pressure of Zafar Khan's assault, the Mongol left wing began to buckle. They were pushed backward, step by bloody step, abandoning their dead and wounded in the dirt. The psychological shock to the Mongol horde was profound and paralyzing. The apex predators of the Asian steppes, the men who had burned Baghdad to ash and humiliated the greatest empires on earth, suddenly realized they had picked a fight with a general who was entirely willing to burn the world down just to watch them die. But as Zafar Khan pushed harder, carving his way deeper into the fleeing Mongol ranks, his bloodlust began to blind his tactical judgment. He was pushing the Mongols back, but he was also pushing himself further and further away from the safety of the main Indian army, stepping blindly toward the deadliest trap in the history of medieval warfare. The greatest and most terrifying weapon in the Mongol arsenal was not the composite bow, and it was not the swift steppe pony. It was human psychology. For generations, the Mongols had perfected a maneuver so deceptively simple that it had wiped out the finest armies of Russia, Europe, and the Middle East, the feigned retreat. It takes an unnatural level of military discipline to pull off. You have to convince an enemy that you are terrified. You have to break formation, drop your weapons, and run for your life, fully accepting that the enemy will butcher your rearguard as you flee. You feed their ego with your own blood until they become blind to the trap. Qutlugh Khwaja, watching from a distance as his left flank was being pulverized into red mist by the sheer, rabid aggression of Zafar Khan, realized he could not win a grinding, face-to-face brawl against this maniac. So he ordered his trumpeters to sound the retreat. Instantly, the Mongol lines collapsed. They turned their horses and bolted into the thick yellow dust, abandoning their dead and leaving a trail of discarded shields and lances. To any rational commander, the sudden flight of the invincible Mongol horde would have been a moment to halt, reform the lines, and wait for the infantry to secure the ground. But Zafar Khan was not rational. He was heavily intoxicated by the adrenaline of the slaughter. When he saw the Mongols turn their backs, he did not see a tactical withdrawal. He saw bleeding prey. Without sending a single messenger back to the Sultan, without waiting for the slow, armored elephants to keep pace, Zafar Khan screamed for a full pursuit. He dug his spurs into his exhausted warhorse and led his elite Rajput and Turkic heavy cavalry in a blind, roaring chase. They chased the Mongol shadows for 18 agonizing miles, 18 miles away from the safety of the main army. 18 miles under a baking sun that cooked the heavily armored Indian riders inside their own steel and leather. Their massive warhorses, bred for devastating short charges rather than cross-country endurance, began to foam at the mouth, their hearts bursting from the strain. Zafar Khan was stringing his own men out across the barren wasteland, completely blinded by the blinding dust kicked up by the retreating Mongols, ignoring every fundamental rule of military survival. And then the dust began to settle. The retreating Mongols did not just slow down, they stopped. With terrifying, synchronized precision, the fleeing steppe riders wheeled their horses around to face their pursuers. As the dust cleared, the horrific reality of the situation crashed down on Zafar Khan's cavalry. They were no longer chasing a broken army. They were standing in the dead center of a massive, meticulously designed kill box. From the left and the right, 10,000 fresh, unblooded Mongol riders materialized from the dunes, closing the loop. The trap had violently snapped shut. The standard protocol for an ambushed cavalry unit is to panic, break, and attempt to flee back the way they came, which is exactly when the Mongols would shoot them in the back. Qutlugh Khwaja watched from a ridge, expecting the arrogant Indian general to finally show fear. He expected them to beg, to run, to die tired. Instead, Zafar Khan did the unthinkable. Recognizing instantly that his horses were too blown to mount a charge or a retreat, he did not even try to maneuver. He simply ordered his men to dismount. In the brutal calculus of medieval warfare, voluntarily getting off your horse when surrounded by light cavalry is the equivalent of digging your own grave. But Zafar Khan was turning the trap inside out. He ordered his men to hobble their exhausted horses and tie them together in a massive circle, creating a makeshift barricade of living flesh and bone to absorb the incoming arrows. He commanded his heavily armored veterans to stand shoulder to shoulder behind their dying horses, draw their powerful infantry bows and wait for the Mongols to come into range. The Mongols had spent 18 miles luring an arrogant cavalry commander into a trap, only to discover they had just locked themselves in a cage with a man who had absolutely zero intention of dying quietly. The Mongols had Zafar Khan perfectly encircled, but a trap is only effective if the prey actually gives up. Zafar Khan's infantry square of dead and dying horses quickly became an impenetrable fortress of flesh. The Mongol archers poured thousands of arrows into the circle, but the heavily armored Indian veterans absorbed the volley, returning fire with their own powerful composite bows. The ground grew slick with blood, and the mountain of corpses, both human and animal, began to form a macabre barricade that physically prevented the Mongol-like cavalry from charging in without breaking their horses' legs. Back at the main battle line, the dust had cleared enough for the rest of the Delhi army to see exactly what had happened. Zafar Khan was trapped 18 miles away. The traditional, logical, and honorable military maneuver would be for Sultan Alauddin Khalji to immediately dispatch his fresh cavalry reserves to break the encirclement and rescue his greatest general. The soldiers waited for the order. The commanders looked to the Sultan, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, ready to ride to the rescue. Alauddin Khalji sat on his horse perfectly still and did absolutely nothing. This is the darkest, most twisted reality of the Battle of Kili. Alauddin was not paralyzed by fear, and he was not committing a tactical error. He was executing a flawless, psychopathic political calculation. Zafar Khan was simply too successful. He was fiercely loved by the men. He was fearless, charismatic, and powerful. In Alauddin's paranoid, tyrannical mind, a general who is loved by the army is just an assassination attempt waiting to happen. The Sultan looked at the distant, swirling storm of Mongol cavalry attacking his best commander and realized that Qutlugh Khwaja was doing him a massive favor. The Mongols were solving his political problem. Alauddin coldly ordered his officers to hold the line. He deliberately abandoned Zafar Khan to die in the dirt. Inside the kill box, the hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. The midday sun baked the armor of the Indian soldiers, turning their steel plates into suffocating ovens. They were dying of thirst, bleeding from a dozen minor wounds, and their quivers were running empty. Zafar Khan looked back toward the horizon, waiting for the banners of his sultan to appear through the heat haze. When the horizon remained completely empty, the crushing weight of the betrayal settled over him. He knew he was a dead man, but instead of despair, the realization triggered something entirely different. It triggered a terrifying, apocalyptic rage. When their arrows finally ran out, the Mongols expected the surviving Indians to drop to their knees and beg for the mercy of slavery. Instead, Zafar Khan and his remaining veterans drew their heavy swords, climbed over the barricade of their own dead horses, and charged directly into the Mongol lines on foot. It was a suicide mission executed with the precision of a slaughterhouse. The brutality of their final stand absolutely defied military logic. Zafar Khan fought like a demon unchained. He was shot through his armor multiple times, bleeding heavily from arrows lodged deep in his limbs, but he simply snapped the wooden shafts off and kept swinging his heavy mace, crushing Mongol skulls and shattering collarbones. The sheer, physical horror of watching a heavily armored man refuse to die deeply unsettled the steppe warriors. Qutlugh Khwaja, watching from a safe distance, was genuinely awestruck. The Mongols respected strength above all else, and the Mongol prince actually ordered his men to pull back. He sent an emissary into the blood-soaked circle, offering Zafar Khan a high-ranking position in the Chagatai Khanate. He promised him wealth, status, and life if he would only bend the knee. Zafar Khan, completely covered in the blood of his enemies and his own men, looked at the emissary and spat. He did not even bother to negotiate. He simply raised his weapon, let out a raw, guttural scream, and resumed the killing. He fought until his muscles literally failed, until his armor was compromised, and until the sheer volume of Mongol bodies overwhelmed him. When Zafar Khan finally fell, completely hacked to pieces in the suffocating dust of Kili, he had taken a staggering number of elite Mongol warriors with him. He was dead, betrayed, and abandoned by his own king. But as the surviving Mongols stood over his broken body, looking at the mountain of their own dead surrounding him, they felt a cold, creeping sensation they had never experienced before. They had killed the general, but he had successfully broken their spirit. When the dust finally settled over the butchered remains of Zafar Khan and his heavy cavalry, there was no triumphant roar from the Mongol horde. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence, broken by the wet, ragged breathing of exhausted horses and the groans of the dying. The Mongols had won the skirmish, but as they stood in the center of the kill box they had designed, the reality of the mathematics began to violently sink in. They had just sacrificed thousands of their most experienced, battle-hardened veterans to annihilate a single, isolated fraction of the Indian army. Zafar Khan had not died like a trapped animal. He had died like a natural disaster, taking a horrific, bloody toll on the elite Chagatai ranks. Qutlugh Khwaja sat on his horse, looking down at the mangled, unrecognizable armor of the Indian general. The Mongol prince was bleeding, his own body battered by the sheer, kinetic violence of the melee. He looked up from the carnage and stared across the 18 miles of baked earth toward the main lines of the Delhi Sultanate. Through the heat haze, he could see that the massive wall of armored war elephants had not moved a single inch. The hundreds of thousands of Indian infantrymen were still locked in their rigid formation. And sitting right in the center of it all was Sultan Alauddin Khalji, watching the slaughter of his own greatest general with the cold, detached interest of a man watching a theater performance. It was in that exact moment that the psychological spine of the Mongol invasion snapped. The Mongol war machine operated on a very specific algorithm of terror. They were the apex predators of the medieval world because they convinced their enemies that resistance was mathematically useless. They relied on kings breaking under pressure, on armies panicking, on formations dissolving into chaotic routs. But as Qutlugh Khwaja stared at the distant banners of Alauddin Khalji, he realized with a creeping existential dread that his algorithm was entirely useless here. He was trying to intimidate a man who possessed absolutely zero human empathy. Alauddin had just intentionally fed his own champion to the wolves purely to solve a domestic political issue. You cannot terrorize a ruler who views his own soldiers as disposable meat. Furthermore, the tactical reality was an absolute nightmare. The Mongol light cavalry, the fastest and deadliest strike force on the planet, had been utterly neutralized. If they tried to launch a full-scale assault against the main Indian line, they would have to ride straight back into the biological meat grinder of the war elephants. Their horses were terrified, their men were physically exhausted, and their invincible aura had been shattered by a single general who refused to understand the concept of surrender. The Chagatai Khanate had marched into India with the explicit goal of exterminating a civilization. Now they were just trying to figure out how to survive the afternoon. As the sun began to set over the plains of Kili, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple and dried blood, Qutlugh Khwaja made a decision that fundamentally altered the course of history. He swallowed his pride, looked at his decimated vanguard, and gave the order. Not a feigned retreat to lure the enemy, not a tactical repositioning, a genuine, humiliating, desperate retreat. Under the cover of darkness, the Mongols resorted to the very tricks desperate prey used to escape them. They built thousands of fake campfires across the plains to create the illusion that they were settling in for a siege. They left their most severely wounded men behind to die in the dirt, abandoning the fundamental brotherhood of the steppe out of sheer self-preservation. Then, in the dead of night, the invincible horde turned their horses around and fled back toward the freezing passes of the Hindu Kush. They retreated with such frantic speed that horses were ridden to death, collapsing on the mountain trails. For the first time in generations, the riders of the steppe spent the entire march constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified that the armored Indian cavalry was coming for them in the dark. Qutlugh Khwaja himself would not survive the journey home, dying from his wounds and the sheer physical exhaustion sustained during the campaign. The monsters who had terrified the world had looked into the eyes of the Delhi Sultanate, and for the very first time in their bloody existence, they blinked. When Alauddin Khalji rode back through the massive stone gates of Delhi, there was no grand, emotional speech honoring the fallen. There was only the cold, mechanical reality of a tyrant consolidating his absolute power. He had saved his empire from total annihilation, but more importantly to him, he had eliminated his only political rival without getting his own hands dirty. In the weeks following the battle, Alauddin did not build a towering monument to Zafar Khan. He did not compensate the families of the heavy cavalrymen who died in the blinding dust of Kili. Instead, he systematically scrubbed Zafar Khan's name from the official court chronicles. He was a dictator so profoundly insecure and paranoid that he was actively jealous of a dead man. This is precisely why you were never taught about the Battle of Kili in school. We are addicted to clean, easily digestible narratives. We want the Battle of Thermopylae. We want noble, morally pure heroes fighting for freedom and justice against a nameless, evil horde. Kili is incredibly uncomfortable. It is a story where the supposed good guys are a heavily militarized police state ruled by a bloodthirsty psychopath, and the bad guys are simply a different flavor of ruthless conquerors. We prefer not to acknowledge the deeply unsettling historical truth that sometimes the only thing capable of stopping a world-ending monster is a monster with thicker armor, zero empathy, and a herd of weaponized elephants. But the ghosts of the Chagatai Khanate do not care about our moral discomfort. The Mongol Empire had spent an entire century convincing the planet that their victory was an inevitable law of nature, just like gravity or the sunrise. Alauddin Khalji and Zafar Khan proved that gravity could be reversed. The Mongols would launch a few more desperate, uncoordinated raids into the Indian subcontinent in the following years, but the psychological spell was permanently shattered. They no longer rode south with the arrogant certainty of apex predators. They rode with the nervous, suffocating hesitation of prey waiting to be ambushed. India remained an impenetrable fortress of violence, one of the very few places on earth that looked the Mongol apocalypse directly in the eye and violently forced it to turn around. If you found this deep dive into the brutal physics and twisted psychology of medieval warfare fascinating, please help us win our own battle against the algorithm by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. We are building a library of history's most incredible, uncomfortable, and forgotten moments, and I want you to be a part of it. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. In the dark, unforgiving calculus of the 13th century, was Alauddin Khalji a necessary evil who did what it took to save his civilization, or was his betrayal of his greatest general an unforgivable act of cowardice? I read every comment, and I would love to hear your debate. If you want to see what happened when another supposedly invincible empire was dragged into the mud and systematically dismantled, click the video on your screen right now. Until next time, keep questioning the official story, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's a warning for the future.